Hi everybody, it's Undead Tal Aviezer here. For this month's episode of Power Word Talk, we're going back into the crypt, the vault, for a retro show recorded way back in March 2021. This was actually the first episode of what would eventually become Power Word Talk. You'll notice the show doesn't have a name yet. We used to just record it live once a month in Cast Party's Discord server, which you can still join at cast-party.com. Before we get started, just a couple of quick programming notes. You may have noticed that we changed the name of our podcast feed to Podcast Party, a D&D podcast. We're doing this to reflect the fact that our feed currently hosts two different shows, Podcast Party Descent into Avernus and Power Word Talk. And later this month, we will be adding a third show, Podcast Party Memories of Holdenshire. Having the whole feed with multiple shows called Podcast Party Descent into Avernus was starting to feel increasingly inaccurate. However, if you've subscribed, the name change won't affect you at all, and our feed is still the place to get new episodes of Podcast Party Descent into Avernus every 2 weeks. We will also be switching to a new hosting service, Anchor, in the next week or so. We've been self-hosting on our site up until now. Again, your subscriptions should, hopefully, be unaffected by that. I suspect the show might disappear from some services for a few hours during the changeover. If you listen to the show on Spotify, which owns Anchor, the transition should be seamless. For other services, I'm going to have to manually reconnect the new RSS feed, so it may take a few hours to come back online. I am boring myself telling you about that. Episode 47 of Podcast Party Descent into Avernus will be out on Monday, October 17, and our new show, in partnership with EN Publishing, Podcast Party Memories of Holdenshire, will premiere on October 22nd. Anyway, this episode has never been shared before in our podcast feed, and it's a suitably spooktacular choice for Halloween because it is a review of one of our favorite Dungeons & Dragons 5e adventures, Curse of Strahd. I'm joined by Matt Gordon and Rachel Tamarin for what I hope is a thoughtful and fun discussion, so enjoy the show, and happy Halloween. Hi, and welcome to Cast Party's first ever informal audio chat show here in Cast Party Discord and wherever else I eventually figure out how to post this file. We are discussing what I think for several of us is our favorite official 5e adventure, Curse of Strahd. I am joined by Cast Party's Matt Gordon and Rachel Tamarin.
Hi.
And I thought, Matt, if it's okay with you, I will set this up by very quickly running through some of the history and origins of this adventure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is sort of originally based on the original Ravenloft module. Modules are what adventures used to be called in the TSR era up until about 1999. What I think is the most boring word you could use instead of saying adventure.
Yeah,
it sounds like a Lamaze class, but it was a module.
I didn't think Lamaze class so much as like some sort of like terrible future where like everybody's a corporate worker and you just like send the modules down the
send it to the worker module. Yeah,
exactly.
So it was the original Ravenloft module, which was published in 1983, and that was by Tracy and Laura Hickman, and that was based on their home game that they would run for their friends every Halloween, and their circle of friends really liked it and would demand, like, let's do that Ravenloft adventure again. Let's do that vampire adventure again. And so they eventually wrote and published it. And at the time, it was a super groundbreaking adventure. This would be in the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons era, just for sort of having a level of characterization and storytelling, some environmental storytelling, but also kind of a character-driven module, which was really rare at the time. Modules in the late 70s, early 80s era were pretty much location-based, map and grid-driven. You enter this room, these are the enemies, this is the treasure. And this was a really different take on that. Of course, Tracy Hickman later really famously went on to write the Dragonlance novels and adventures with Margaret Weiss. but Ravenloft is probably his other like really huge contribution to Dungeons and Dragons. And it was sort of reinvented in every succeeding edition. And all there is in the original Adventure Castle Ravenloft is the castle, Barovia Village. That's it. And eventually Ravenloft became this whole nether realm, and there were many different kingdoms and areas, each sort of having a different element of gothic horror and a different dark lord or being that ruled over them. And it became a whole campaign setting. It's weird because the Ravenloft is the name of the castle that Strahd lives in, but also sort of became, because it's, I think, for no other reason except it's a great name. Kind of the name for the setting. Although I think that in game they were called the Domains of Dread. Is that right? They're not actually called Ravenloft. That's correct. Yeah, each individual portion or section, I don't know, they're not necessarily countries. They're sort of city states, sub-dimensional city states. Yeah. But you would, as a human being in the real world, you would sort of refer to that whole Gothic zone as Ravenloft. Yeah, definitely.
Right.
And then, it was sort of reinvented for second edition and third edition, and then fourth edition and fifth edition. Curse of Strahd was really the arrival of Ravenloft into fifth edition. It was published in March of 2016, and it appears, I'd say, at or near the top of a lot of people's lists of like, what's your top 10 favorite official 5e adventure?
Yeah.
It's really critically popular adventure. Genesis is a little different. They kind of got some buy-in from Tracy Hickman and Laura Hickman. I think Tracy and Laura wrote the preface for the Curse of Strahd hardcover. A lot of 5e stuff is known for like fairly extensive semi-public playtesting and tweaking and refining. From what I could gather and research, kind of not the case with Curse of Strahd. There are rumors that it was written by Christopher Perkins mostly in 11 days. It's sort of this frenzy of writing this like 220, 250 page, really dense adventure source book. There are some other, Adam Lee, I think, wrote Death House, which is the introductory adventure. And there are a couple of other contributing writers, but I feels like very much a Chris Perkins adventure to me. And I think he was responsible for the bulk of it. And it was not as extensively play tested as a lot of the 5e stuff. It's just kind of like he churned it out. And it's kind of this lightning in a bottle thing. It's a pretty amazing adventure. And I think captures in a really economical way a lot of the stuff that people really love about the feel of Ravenloft, while very much making it part of the new 5th edition way of doing Dungeons and Dragons. So with that, I mean, I go on and on, but I think that's a good like general overview of what we're talking about here. I will go ahead and say, Matt, what is your experience with this adventure?
So I'm a Ravenloft nut. I started when I was middle school doing D&D, and I think I gravitated away from a lot of what most kids were doing in that space, which was probably mostly Forgotten Realms. Dragonlance was really hot, and everybody was going nuts over Dragonlance. I read the books, I liked them, but I wasn't keen to play in that space, to be perfectly honest. And I saw the art in I6, as it was called, the Ravenloft first edition module, and I was like, oh, wait a second. This looks very different from the things that I've seen in terms of, as we were talking about, the adventure modules. And it looked like, wait, is this correct? I opened it up a little bit, and it was basically you're hunting down Dracula in his castle. And I was like, oh, wait, this is Dungeons and Dragons? I couldn't believe it for a second. And then I read the thing from cover to cover and saw a very interesting thing, which I think was the first of its kind, which was this sort of weird isometric, three-dimensional map, which from my perspective, just because I could not really, I could think in 2 dimensions. Graph paper was like a friend of mine back in middle school, but 3 dimensions to understand that this place had not only the X and Y axis, but the Z axis. You could go up and down this thing up to the top tower, and it looked enormous. Like, it looked like the kind of thing that if I actually played this, I would spend days making maps of this enormous castle. When I thought about it, I was like, this is amazing. And it introduced this character of Strahd, and I read it, and I was like, okay, so they sort of took the best parts of Dracula, and they really just distilled it down to vampire lord who loses his love, I guess you could call her, obsesses, turns himself into a vampire, and is fated to remain in this castle until, you know, you defeat him. And there's all kinds of awful undead monsters and creatures in there and all kinds of traps. And it was very, very thematic, and I really digged it. As Ravenloft went into second edition, and you now had a boxed set of Ravenloft, which for me was like, oh, just give me more candy. Like, now it's not just Ravenloft or Barovia, it's more of these places. It's more sort of falling into these gothic horror, hammer horror kind of tropes of, oh, there's a guy who's the Victor Frankenstein trope, and then there's like the mummy trope, and then there's the Lich Lord trope, and then there's, you know, the actual historical Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler trope.
Vlad the Impaler, yeah.
I was just eating it up. But the key thing that made it different for me, Ravenloft as a whole, as a product in second edition and forwards, was the key differential was that it didn't make it sort of, it was a real change from the whole murder hobo thing, where it was literally like, well, no, you don't just go into a dungeon to defeat monsters, get treasure, and then walk home and be like, look, I'm rich. It was a kind of adventure that you could dig into.
I think, you know, and that's something they've done over and over again very well in 5e, is hit the right notes of nostalgia, but it's also new. You know, it's also current, and it also has a more modern sensibility to it. And that's the other thing I did want to ask you about, as someone who's familiar with both the sort of 80s version of this and the modern version of this, and Strahd's character. And you mentioned his, I wouldn't really say love, but the sort of the focus of his obsession.
Definitely.
Poliana. To me, Curse of Strahd is very much about toxic masculinity.
I agree.
And it's not only in the character of Strahd, but that sort of toxic relationship with Irina is mirrored in other characters throughout the adventure, right? There's Izek Strasny, who's objectifies Irina, makes dolls of her, and is obsessed with controlling her or possessing her in some way. There's Rahadin, the elven chamberlain who assisted Strahd in exterminating all of the other female elves. So my question is, do you think that is something that's different about Curse of Strahd, or something that thread has been there all along, like going back to the sort of Tracy Hickman, Laura Hickman version of this, and they've just sort of pulled on that thread?
I think you're right. The original influences of this adventure come from Dracula, from Bram Stoker's Dracula. And overall, Gothic horror stems from an era that has a lot of influence of what we now call toxic masculinity, although it was known that you had rather famous people like Lord Byron, for example, who was this sort of effete romantic poet.
Writer?
He was essentially a lot of poets at the time, a lot of writers at the time, felt that Byron himself was kind of a what's the best word?
Predator?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This sort of romantic predator that was the influence for a lot of the Gothic horror stereotypes of the time.
But let me ask you, Rachel. This is Rachel Tamarin, Ophelia Liaden podcast party. You have played Curse of Strahd, correct?
Yes.
How many times?
Well, I've played it one and maybe a quarter times thus far. It's I'm part of an ongoing campaign, playing it a second time. It's thankfully, this is also something amazing I think about Curse of Strahd, because it's got such a high replay value, because when you have an element like Madame Ava's prophecy, the possibilities are endless, really, of where these items could come from that you need to defeat Strahd.
So let me just
it's like a completely different adventure. Yeah,
that's also something that was in the original adventure, but the Curse of Strahd sort of expands the possibilities of that Taroka deck reading. I think the original adventure just told you where the 3 treasures were that you needed to defeat Strahd, and then where the final confrontation Strahd would take place. Curse of Strahd also gives you a card that tells you who your ally is.
Yeah, there's 5 cards. It's basically set up like a tarot reading, right? Where you have this sort of cross tarot reading. So you have 3 in a line, and then top and bottom. The 3 items, as you said, the 3 items are the 3 items that will help you defeat Strahd, which are carried over into the 5e adventure. Then there is the ally, and then there is the final card where you actually will face off against Strahd.
Yeah, and the moral crisis for you as a DM is whether to rig that or not, or to let the cards fall, where they may, so to speak, and end up with something really awesome or really frustrating.
I'll let you in on a secret. I've done it both ways. One, because I was thinking to myself, this group I think would benefit from this kind of play out, and I was right. I put in specific allies that I thought that they would find intriguing, and sort of against the norm of what they would normally think would be an ally. Like, oh, it's a vampire hunter, obviously he's going to be the ally. Or where they would face off against Strahd. I wanted to make it really epic.
But Rachel, as a woman, I wanted to ask you, playing through Curse of Strahd, so I've heard sort of different takes from different women about the experience of playing through this adventure, vis-a-vis the recurrent themes of toxic masculinity. So I've heard the take that it's not fun for me as a woman to be in this world where these atrocities are being committed against women. It's not necessarily what I would describe as like a fun fantasy escape,
right?
To be dealing with these situations.
Yes.
But I've also, I'm running it currently for a group that is 6 women and 1 guy. And I have gotten some feedback from them that it actually feels heroic for them because the adventure is not saying that behavior is correct or acceptable. And you essentially are getting to be a hero in kind of overcoming these oppressive systems and these, sort of horrible characters that have done terrible things to women. You either get to sort of avenge them or aid them or, sort of punish the evildoers in some way. And I'm just wondering, what's your take on that?
Yes. Let me start by saying I think that both of those perspectives are really equally valid. And I certainly understand, so many people play Dungeons and Dragons as an escape, as a fantasy world where you're not limited by the restrictions of the real world, oppressive forces like patriarchy and racism and xenophobia and all of that stuff. But I would say for me, my perspective playing it, at least the first time I've played it thus far, was really, and I think maybe it depends to some extent on your dungeon master and the group that you're playing with too. But for me, it certainly felt a lot more like what your players currently, Tal, are articulating, that it was like, I'm glad that this is something that part of it too for me is, Dungeons and Dragons often has a reputation for not always being, it's certainly gotten much, much better in recent years. And with the presence of 5th edition, I think they've really done a wonderful job of being mindful and being more inclusive. But there's this kind of stereotype that, that comes from something in the Dungeons and Dragons universe where it has not always been a friendly or welcoming environment to women. I remember the very first time I ever played Dungeons and Dragons and we were going through the minis. And I was one of the few women, I think, to play with this group of friends that I was playing with. I was the only woman in the campaign at the time. And so we're going through all the minis, and they were old minis, a lot of them, it was like, I think mostly from like the 90s or the early 2000s, but I couldn't find a mini that didn't have like a battle thong or a bikini or like a fully exposed leg. And it was, it was frustrating to me because I was like, I get that these are old and they're outdated. And certainly there are a number of companies that make really wonderful minis so that you can, if you want to wear a battle thong, you can wear a battle thong. But if you want, full plate armor, you can.
It's just that the battle thong, it's not that they just can't be the only option.
Exactly. Exactly. It can be really empowering to fight in a battle thong, but if that's all you can be, you do get limited. And so to see, an adventure campaign that really acknowledged that, the sort of why feminism is important and why inclusivity is important and allows you the opportunity to fight back against toxic masculinity, to me was very interesting, very powerful, and very significant. I'm also a big fan of Gothic horror and romantic horror. I wanted to throw out my girl Mary Shelley, particularly because we talked about Lord Byron as one of the pioneers of Gothic literature. Of course, she wrote Frankenstein, which also clearly an influence in the 5e edition of Curse of Strahd. I think we talked about before. I am blanking on.
Oh, it's the Abbot, which is sort of another mirrh of that same sort of fucked up.
I mean, literally,
like building a wife out of corpses to give to Strahd as like the perfect woman.
Talk about objectification.
The Abbot is the Abbot's a deva, which are like angelic creatures. He's just like an insane angel that sort of fell into Barovia and has been hiding amongst the commoners. Essentially, they stay away from him. But yeah, he's making this flesh golem for Strahd in the hopes that it may actually satisfy him, which is just massively fucked up.
Yeah, and it's a great example of how the setting can serve as a mashup for all of these different tropes, right? Because in that Abbot building, I think Vasilka is the name of the flesh golem that he's making for Strahd. You've got Frankenstein, you've got Bride of Frankenstein. Yep. You've kind of got Metropolis, right? Like the old Fritz Lang movie where he builds the robot lady.
Yes.
And you've also, in the Abbot, you've kind of got this like a Paradise Lost, like Lucifer, you know, sort of evil fallen angel.
I was thinking about Dr. Moreau. Dr. Moreau.
He's also making these
in the Abbot. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And he it reminds me of the angel in Neverwhere too. You know, sort of similar. Islington, yeah. The stuff that you were saying about, you know, inviting women into this game and 5e doing a lot better job. I think the game book art has come a long way. I mean, I can only imagine how off-putting, because it really was all tits.
Oh my gosh. Was it 1E or 2E? Maybe it was both. That had like a separate set of stats for women and a stat. They were naturally like weaker.
It was 1E.
It was 1E.
Literally the women's strength capped out at a lower level than the male strength. Yes. Which is a sort of a signal, you know, to almost like don't play. Or if you're going to play, you're going to be pigeonholed into this very specific role. Yeah. And not going to be allowed to have the agency to play the character that you would like to play. Right. In this fantasy game where nothing, you know, it's where no limits are being imposed on these guys. But I think that, you know, that 5e has really listened. That it's not, there certainly have been some mistakes, but they're actually, you can say to their credit, they're trying to address this stuff.
Absolutely.
You know, that they have come a long way. And speaking of which, we should mention one aspect of this adventure that even in the 5 years since it's been published has sort of come home to roost a little bit is the Vistani.
Yep.
Yes.
The Vistani in the original Ravenloft adventure, I don't think the word Vistani was used yet. I actually think they were just called gypsies.
Gypsies. Yep. They used gypsies.
Not good. That term, which is an offensive term, was almost completely eliminated from Curse of Strahd. They managed to leave it in once when they lifted a block of text from the original adventure without looking at it too carefully.
Right. But I believe it was fixed in the re-release, right?
So they recently re-released it and removed the word gypsy. But the other thing they did is, you know, it's not just the word gypsy. It's that the Vistani are based on sort of real world stereotypes of Eastern European Roma.
The Romani people. Yeah.
They're depicted as culturally thieves, and a lot of alcoholism, and, you know, sort of stereotypical behavior and dress that even when you remove the word gypsy, you really should be more sensitive than that. And I think that since even the 2016 publication of this, they've done further steps. I think they've realized they fucked up. And the latest editions of Curse of Strahd that have been released, there's actually been 2 special editions released in the past 12 months. There's a Curse of Strahd revamped. Comes in a nice little coffin box. And the even more expensive Beetle and Grimm Curse of Strahd Silver Edition, which I did blow. Like the first $500 that I made on Cast Party, I immediately went and blew it on that.
Money were well spent, I think.
Yeah, great. But in those editions of the adventure, they have also tweaked not just removing the word gypsy, but tweaking some of the language describing how these people behave so that it plays less into that stereotype.
Yep.
And the other tweak they made was the character of Esmeralda, who is a Vistani. She's an amputee. She had her leg bitten off by a werewolf and replaced by a really cool looking prosthesis.
So badass. Steampunk
and the original text said that she was ashamed of her injury and made every effort to conceal it.
Which made no sense, especially because it was a very conspicuous gold-plated steampunk leg, which was awesome.
Yeah. So they've
Why
also
would you
removed,
conceal it? Yes.
Yeah, they've removed the character note for her that she should be ashamed of being an amputee. I think quite rightly. So that's no reason for that. But it's interesting that Dungeons and Dragons adventures in the digital age have become sort of living documents in a way that they weren't before. That you kind of keep going back and updating and rewriting them. But I think I approve of all those changes. I think that was the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
And they're about to. One of the reasons we're doing this little chat is there's about to be another Ravenloft book. This will only be the second Ravenloft book of the 5th edition era. Von Richten's Guide.
I am ecstatic.
I've
been waiting since the beginning of 5th edition for an actual published work to follow in the success that has been Curse of Strahd. And I think
this is sorry, I just want to get the title out. It's Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. It almost there were all the Von Richten's Guide in 2nd edition. There were Von Richten's guides to vampires, Von Richten's Guide to werewolves and beasts. I think it was actually called Von Richten's Guide to Beasts. Von Richten's Guide to the Walking Dead. All of these, Von Richten. Obviously, he's the Van Helsing pseudonym or replacement or whatever you want to call him. Yeah. But he himself, the character of Von Richten in 5th edition is, and technically actually from before, is a very strange one, I'll be honest, because Van Richten, as a character, you expect, the opposite of Dracula, the Van Helsing character, to be the sort of shining paragon of where you want your characters to go in terms of, you want to trust this guy. I'll tell you, the times that I have played with my parties, none of them have trusted or liked the character of Van Richten. I think it's probably because he treats Esmeralda so poorly. I think Esmeralda, I think is as they call her, so as they call her, his protege. But I feel like she never really gets the chance to. I mean, you can role play it any way you want, but he starts in and he pretends like he's not actually Von Richten. He's this guy Rictavio, and he's got this weird sort of tiger in a cage thing going on where he's got some trapped animal, and he doesn't really do a whole lot unless you choose him as unless you find him through the cards as your ally. And I don't know, I just get the feeling, at least from the way that my player saw it, and to some degree the way he's characterized in the book, that Von Richten is not the most. He's an obsessive character in and of himself. How about that?
Yeah, I think he's someone who has sacrificed his own humanity at the feet of his mission of vengeance against Strahd. Right, this is fundamental coldness about him.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
And I think his rejection of Esmeralda is a rejection of I can't have human relationships.
Yeah,
I need to I'm going to fail. I can either do this job or I can be a human.
Yeah,
there's sort of no middle road there, and I think it makes him prickly in that way. And he's kind of amoral, right? He's sort of like the classic, like take care that you become don't become the thing that you fight against.
Right. Right.
He's done some. His backstory has some pretty questionable moral stuff that he's done. I think as far as his utility in the adventure, I've never had a group that drew him as an ally. But his main function, plot-wise, has been as an interpreter of what the Taroka deck means for characters who might be struggling to understand and who need some help as to what the deck might be pointing them towards. That he's familiar with the some of the locations of Barovia.
Johnny Exposition, I always call him.
Yeah. He's exactly Johnny Exposition. I don't tend to make it very difficult for the party to sort of pierce the veil of his Rictavio persona, because I think they have limited reason to try. It's very easy to just leave him alone. It's okay. It's weird carny guy. So I generally have made it fairly easy for them to find out who he is and develop a rapport with him so that he can at least convey necessary plot information. I think it might be a mistake for some DMs to gate that behind too much of counting on the players to dig into him.
Yeah.
You know, it's really funny that you guys both say that, because that was not my experience at all.
Interesting.
Playing with that character. I don't know if this was a choice by my DM or just the way my party went. And my party was a pretty experienced group of players, so I don't think we needed a lot of terms of interpreting the cards. We were kind of able to do it on our own. So maybe that's also, we just didn't have a lot of reason to talk to him early on. I mean, we certainly encountered him as Rictavio, and he helped us with a fight kind of, relatively early on, where it was like there was above a tavern or something. I don't remember exactly what the deal was.
The coffin shop.
The coffin shop. That's what it was. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Above the coffin shop. He helped us kill the vampires above the coffin shop. But then we were like, oh, this crazy carny guy. I guess he knows some stuff. Clearly he's got more to him. But then we just kind of went off on our adventure and we didn't really encounter him much.
I can very easily see that.
Yeah. But yeah, it took a long time actually for us to realize who he was. And it wasn't until after we met Esmeralda and we began to talk to her that we realized, oh, Von Richten was Rictavio. And, in hindsight with the naming convention, we probably should have figured it out. But, we had no reason to believe that Von Richten was definitely going to be in the campaign. So, but for that reason, I think, he wasn't really an expository device for us. We left him alone, but then we went back to him, before the big fight. Although he was not our designated in the cards ally, our ally was actually, it's not spoilers if I say, right? We've spoiled a lot already, I guess, if that's the case. Our ally was Mordenkainen, which was a pretty amazing ally to have. That was amazing.
Lucky duck.
I will just say, Mordenkainen, it's one element that in my 2 times running this, I've never used him because both groups of players would not have known or cared who he was.
Yeah, fair enough.
Like he's a celebrity to me, but they would have been like, wizard.
That's so funny because, I wasn't really familiar. Most of my friends that I was playing with had played, many, many iterations of Dungeons and Dragons. I had played also 4th edition just because it was the one that was out when I started playing, which I'm a much bigger fan of 5th edition, and I'll just leave it at that. But I didn't know who he was. I still thought he was pretty cool just because he was a really powerful wizard and a really good ally to have in the fight. But all of this to say, so he was our official ally, but then we were friendly enough with Esmeralda that she wanted to fight with us anyway against Strahd. Obviously, she had plenty of reason to. And then once we found out that Von Richten was Von Richten, we were like, hey, you want to come help us kill Strahd? And he was like, totally. So we had like a fun little band by the time we got in there, which was pretty cool. But yeah, so he just, I never really thought much of him. I mean, I didn't trust him when he was Rictavio and obviously had some big secrets. But by the time it was revealed who he was, I was just like, oh, cool. Like a monster hunter that will help us kill this vampire. Great. So, yeah, I guess my experience was just very, very different with him.
Yeah. I mean, I think Curse of Strahd really, like most of the 5e big adventure books, there's more there than you can really use in any one given playthrough.
Oh, yeah.
But that's great because there's replayability then.
Absolutely.
Especially for the DM.
Yes. And it's so cool too, I think, because, there's so many things that happen in the timeline, regardless of whether or not you ever are aware of them as a player. There's all of this stuff happening all the time, and it's such a rich universe that you never even know what could be out there. The second time that I'm playing it again as a player, and we've had the cards dealt, and sure, I know who the one guy that our ally is, but I have no idea where like some of the other areas are that are described, and like I know I didn't go to this place. I have no idea where it is, so it's exciting. So, even having played the game and being very familiar with a lot of it, I still don't know a lot.
So speaking of places, like I'm actually I'm dying to find out about, like, if we can sort of take our minds back to when we first either DM'd or ran this, right? The book itself, and I'm looking at it right now, it's split up into 15 chapters. And first of all, amazing. And at the end of it, at the end of the entire book is an appendix, which is actually the first 3 levels of your playing in Curse of Strahd, which is the Death House.
Death House is the optional appendix, which happens to be like one of the best beginning adventures in 5e, and it's just like this optional.
Hands down.
If you don't want to start at level 3, you can run them through this.
It's interesting that you say that. It's interesting that you say that it's the best.
I don't know if it's the best, but I think it's one of the best.
Totally, and I think that there is some debate as to whether or not Death House is a good way. Not only is it a good quote unquote beginning way of starting this adventure, or a good way of starting any adventure. I am of the mindset that it is fun and it is good. And the 2 times that I've run it, they definitely liked it. And it sort of definitely sets the tone for the entire campaign. But I guess the sort of idea of this multi-level house, let's call it for what it is. It's a dungeon crawl, being the way to start the entire very large, land spanning gothic horror adventure that eventually ends up in a dungeon crawl anyway in the castle. There's some sort of duality of that to some degree, but I think that like Death House in and of itself it's punishing to some degree for players.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of people get turned off by that to some degree.
I agree, and I do think basically my advice would be, especially the lower dungeon part of Death House, you've just got to dial back a couple of those encounters. It is too much for a level 2 party. It's I think I ran it through Kobold Fight Club today, and there's 2 rooms in that lower dungeon that are not meant to be climactic, but they are both would rate as deadly. In Kobold Fight Club. I don't think that's
the Shambling Mount fight, which is just
the Shambling Mount fight. I get because that's supposed to be like, let's get the fuck out of here. Like you're not supposed to stand there and go toe to toe with that, but I think a lot of players will.
A lot of players, you're damn straight. A lot of players will. A lot of players are like, oh, come on, this is the boss fight. Oh, we have to beat the boss.
But it's like, okay, you can have one. You can have a deadly boss in your thing. I think Shambling Mount probably is too much, but it's like that is the boss fight of that adventure. At least there's like just a arbitrary room with 4 ghouls in it that'll absolutely TPK a level 2 party. There's one thing that makes 5 shadows attack you, which will also easily TPK a level 2 party. Those are the ones where I'm like, this is not the main event, and you're probably going to kill them right here. I think you gotta watch it with that. Interestingly, I have never run Death House as part of the Curse of Strahd campaign because I saw it, read it. I'm like, I got to run this right away. So I've only run it separately as one shots. The both times that I've run Curse of Strahd, I have run completely outside of Barovia, like normal D&D. Let's go on a few low level adventures.
And then you brought them
for levels 1 to 3 and then bring them through the mist. So they're like a regular Dungeons and Dragons adventuring party before they come to Barovia. And then I've used the sort of letter from the Burgomaster,
right?
The false letter, pleading for help.
Right.
That's funny. Oh,
no, go ahead, Rich.
I was just gonna say both times the hook for my parties has been your werewolf hunters. You've been called to investigate the disappearances of some children in the area. So we have like usually 1 or 2 fights kind of on the way to Barovia with the wolves or possibly, a werewolf if you can track them properly and catch up to them. But then it's, you're just right in the Death House basically is your first big adventure.
The cool thing about Death House, which I think sort of sets it off against all the other introductory adventures, is I think that people know, even if they've never read anything about Curse of Strahd, and they're like, oh, well, clearly we're going into Gothic Horrorville. And, we walk through a mist. We can't get back because if we start walking back through the mist, not only are we ending the adventure because obviously, I walk back through the mist. Okay, well, you can't get back through the mist. Oh, invisible wall. I get it. Okay, great. No problem. We walk forward. And then it sets up this village that just appears out of nowhere. And you're like, oh, okay, Gothic horror trope. I'm all right with it. Let's move on. And then the creepy 2 little kids come up. And you're like, okay. Stepping forward into Gothic horror trope number 5, creepy kids. Do I shine creepy kids? Probably not. But that's okay. I'll just go into this house because there's a monster in the basement. Oh, okay, monster in the basement. Okay, I get it. So in a way, I think even the most sort of... even the players who are just set on fulfilling the whatever tropes that they have in the back of their mind, either about Dungeons and Dragons and role playing or about Gothic horrors, role in role playing in general, I think that none of them are really scared. You could do as much description. You can have a creepy baby. You can have kid ghosts. You can have all kinds of stuff that happen in the death house. And yes, it is atmospheric, and you can have music and lighting, whatever it was. I think that the problem with Death House is that it attempts to sort of shove down your throat, you should be scared. This is a scary Dungeons and Dragons adventure. And I don't think a lot of players fall for that. No matter how good of a DM you are and how well you describe things, they are in the back of their mind, they're always thinking tropes, what are my powers, what are my advantages, how can I overcome these challenges based on the advantages that my hero and the group can pose. It's not as if you walk into this house with no weapons, no powers, you're just a dude. Like, that's horror, right? Well, you are powerless.
Yeah. So as a counterpoint to that, I have terrified 2 groups of players with this adventure. And I think it has entirely to do with who my players were versus who your players were.
Okay.
Because my players were all new to the game. They did not think in terms of, these are my character mechanics. This is how I will Dungeons and Dragons this house.
I gotcha.
For them, they were learning the game and learning what could and couldn't happen. I think if you're trying to evoke terror as a storyteller or as a DM or as any kind of, writer, really, your biggest ally is the unknown.
Absolutely.
Right. Once you define a threat, often ceases to be scary, because what you want to engage the player's imagination and turn it against them, because they will always, whatever they imagine is going on will inevitably be more terrifying than what is actually going on. The sense of not knowing and dread is what you're going for. So the longer you can conceal from them the explanation, the more you can sustain terror, which is, Stephen King calls it like the finest of emotions, right? His thing is like, I'm going for terror. If I can't terrify you, I will horrify you.
Yep.
Right.
If I can't horrify you, I'll just go for the gross out.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I think Death House, if you can ratchet the pace and the exposition very skillfully, and if you're lucky enough to have players that maybe don't know the game that well, aren't so confident that my such and such hit points and my such and such cantrips and my such and such abilities will be, this is how I will see this situation through the lens of my character sheet.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's harder to scare anyone who's approaching the game like that. And I think inevitably, the more you play, the more you kind of tend to become that sort of player.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say to counter that, is that I think an experienced player can enjoy a dungeon crawl like that if they really commit to their character, which is what I find. I mean, I come from a theater background anyway, as do we all. But I think really trying to think like your character and embody your character and see how your character encounters the world makes the difference. I kind of always as a player, but certainly in a setting like that where it's like, okay, the house is super haunted and there's going to be a certain amount of like ghosts and ghouls that jump out at you, but like if you see it as like, oh my god, like these little kids need help, I'm gonna go help them, and then you go into this weird environment and you're like, oh my god, things aren't what they seem, how do I figure out what's going on? Maybe you're expecting some stuff to jump out at you, but that's how I find that it enriches the experience. But I guess that's
I feel like it's the difference between Ghost Hunters, the show Ghost Hunters, where people are clearly acting to some degree, like in order to terrify you, the viewer, right? Yeah. Oh, what was that? Oh god! And the lights and the faux whatever that's going on. The difference between Ghost Hunters and Ghostbusters, right? Where you have literally a bunch of dudes who go into a clearly what is meant to be terrifying situation and either use humor or their own abilities to counteract that.
Sure. Yeah. I think the beauty of Curse of Strahd is it is by turns both of those things.
Yeah, yes. It is. You're right.
And it's also it's everywhere from like Christopher Lee, like Hammer horror, to Bram Stoker gothic horror to like RKO movie shit. Right, like with the Wolfman and like the Mummy and the Fish Guy and like that is absolutely all in there too.
Sure.
And you know, you're going for Bram Stoker's Dracula, and you know the cliche is that's what the DM wants, and the players are going for Dead and Loving It.
Yep.
Right,
that was 100%.
You know, or what we do in Shadows. And that's fine. I mean, that's there's sort of inevitability that's going to have that dimension to it. But I think how do I want to say this? Actors maybe tend to be more scareable than the average person on the street.
They're very
I think
sensitive.
Sensitive, yeah, because they're sensitive, and I think the sort of imaginative people probably scare a little easier.
I would say that's fair.
Their own brain will scare them. You know?
You know what though? It's also, I think, really to an extent about what is the environment the dungeon master is cultivating. You know, like you can, you know, and then some people don't enjoy, like, you know, they feel it's a little edgelordy to be like, turn down the lights and we're only going to use candles. I mean, I wouldn't recommend only using actual candles because you knock one of those over. It's hard to see, potential fire hazard. However, doing a little, you know, like when we played, we would regularly kind of like just dim the lights a little bit, and like there'd be some like spooky music in the background, and then
that's just fun. I mean, that's just creating an event kind of.
Exactly. I mean, it's we spend a lot of time and energy doing that for cast parties, live events when we're able to host them. It's part of the experience, but I think it can really enhance the environment, and it's like you feel like you're really part of, like, you know, the collective storytelling experience, which is Dungeons and Dragons.
It's just so difficult, though, and I hate to go back to the well here, but to have an atmospheric game, I think in some degree, an atmosphere that sort of generates fear and horror and threat is counteracted to some degree by the fact that you have a mechanic that sort of deviates sharply from that, which is combat.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Okay, well, we're going to pretend like all that spooky shit that we just talked about and all the atmosphere that we just generated is immediately dropped, and now we're going into time slows down.
Roll initiative.
And roll initiative. Right? Words roll initiative have been the bane of many a DM's sort of storytelling experience if they can't find a way to fashion the story into the mechanics. It's kind of like really taking a square peg and shoving it into a round hole to some degree, because they feel very different. Because your left brain switches into right brain, or right brain switches into left brain when you go away from the creative process into, okay, I have to manage resources, I have to do math, I have to move my piece into an advantageous area. Like, all of this stuff sort of slips away from you suddenly.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is tension generated by that very mechanical gameplay. But I think that's more of the oh fuck, Corbin has just failed 2 death saves sort of tension.
I can't imagine where that might happen.
Yeah, you know, which is a different animal, right?
Yes.
But I think you can't really sustain terror in that way in D&D. But I've been able to do it by, like, the Nothic that all of a sudden starts broadcasting your personal secrets, you know, from your backstory, just like whispering them to you and to other, and like they don't know what the fuck that is or where that's coming from. So I think you can get those moments like that where, you know, it's like, what is happening?
Right.
That have nothing really to do with the dice rolling or the mechanics.
Right.
You can't keep that up for 4 hours, nor I think would you want to, but you can get that minute, you know?
Yes. Yeah. And actually, something I really like about Curse of Strahd and the instructions to the DM, which I was allowed to read after we played the game the first time, I kind of flipped through. So I am familiar somewhat with the DM mechanics, although I have not DM'd the game myself, is they give you suggestions as the dungeon master for, like, what are little things you can say and do to increase the atmosphere, and, like, really try to think about, like, how do you describe the wind rustling through the trees, or, like, how do you know, like, little details just about the world in general, like the fact that if you cast Mage Hand, it's always a skeletal hand, but you know, and maybe you don't say that every single time you cast Mage Hand, but putting those little suggestions out into the universe, I found to be very effective in terms of creating an environment that sort of creeped you out.
Oh
overall.
yeah. I love the changes to the spells. And one of the current players, when they entered Barovia and she summoned her familiar had been sent away, and she summoned the familiar back, which was an owl, and it was this undead skeleton owl when it came back.
Yeah.
Or one of them is playing with what's the new kind of fighter from Wildmount that has the duplicate?
Echo Knight.
Echo Knight. So one of them is an Echo Knight, which PS don't let anyone play that at your table. It's hideously overpowered. But as I've learned for 7 levels of this. But so her Echo Knight is dead. Right? It's like her, but it's a walking corpse. Like as soon as it's been like the sort of zombified version of her.
That's so cool.
I like
yeah.
it a lot.
Yeah.
So it's fun to do that kind of thing, which, you know, for the first minute when that happened, that was a what the fuck is going on kind of moment. It's not campaign long, but if you can find those moments to sprinkle in, it's great.
So I'll ask the two of you a question. Speaking of what the fuck moments, like, we have expectations going into Curse of Strahd that it's basically going to be a vampire hunt. I mean, he's on the cover. But I'm interested to know, because even for people like me who played the original I6 and then moved into 2nd edition and played the same thing over and over, and there's the nostalgia there. But the great things about Curse of Strahd was the expansion of that world into Barovia and the what the fuck moments that came with it. And I'm interested to know if you have either examples of either places or individuals or vignettes maybe that were part of the part of your campaign that you guys would want to comment on or cite.
You go first, Rachel.
Well, I had a question sort of by what you made. Was the what the fuck inherent, or was it just sort of like things that we liked? Because if we're talking what the fuck, okay. Well, you know what, actually, before I say a particular place or circumstance that I enjoyed, something that I wanted to say is that I kind of wish that the adventure was not called Curse of Strahd, because of course it's immediately apparent. Like, he's on the cover. It's about a vampire. Strahd is clearly the vampire. You're going to have to kill the vampire. But so much of atmospherically what you can start out with and what is effective is like this sense of like, potentially this sense of security. Like, Strahd is very welcoming depending on the circumstances. Right. When we did it, it was like we beat Death House, and then it was like, oh my god, like, you took care of that creepy haunted house that had been like this pesky thing for tourists and newcomers. Please come have dinner at Strahd's castle, and you know, like, we want to thank you.
If you hadn't known the title and seen the cover,
exactly, it could have just been like, oh, this nice man that runs the city. Like, you know, I mean, we might have been suspicious anyway, again, as seasoned players, but it's like, there's so much about it that has this potential to be really subtle, but then it can't be because, you know, or like any early mention you see like in the library in Death House. If you look through the books and like you find some stuff about the history of Strahd and like, you know, presumably like his great grandfather or whatever. I mean, spoilers, he's a vampire, so it's him the whole time. Like, of course you know that when you're reading it, you know, but if it was just like, oh, that's a name that's mentioned, interesting, like if you happen to do it and then, you know, maybe you associate it later with like the guy that still runs the city, but you're not going to be like, of course he's a vampire, you know what I mean? And I don't know that there's really any way, even if you didn't call it Curse of Strahd, you might, you know, pretty easily realize it's a vampire based adventure. But yeah, I wish, you know, I wish that it wasn't all immediately given away and you have to sort of suspend your sense of
what was the moment that really worked for you though, that was like, wow, that's surprising? That's a great I'm trying to think of like, I mean, I think there was this scene even with Strahd and the conventions of Strahd when he'd asked to meet with us, and I was playing a bard. Actually, I was playing Ophelia in that campaign. That was the origination of my Ophelia character. Okay. So I was playing Ophelia, I was playing a bard, and you like walk into the dining room. I think it was the dining room. And he's like playing the organ, and of course it's that quintessential. And of course we had, you know, the sound effects and stuff. And he's playing and he's speaking to us. And I was like, oh, can I sit next to him? And I want to try to play, you know, along with him. And of course, as soon as I went to go sit next to him on the bench, he just disappeared and he wasn't ever there. And that was very like,
even knowing all of the conventions of the story and knowing he was this evil vampire and whatever, that moment took me by surprise, and that was pretty cool.
If I were your DM, I would have had you sit next to him, and the two of you would have played heart and soul. That's what I would.
Oh my god.
Yeah, chopsticks.
Well, there's the whimsy coming in, which is also inherent, as parts of the game. Talking about whimsy, I will say just a plug for my number one favorite character from Curse of Strahd, which is Blinksy the toy maker.
Oh my god!
Is no fun, is no Blinksy. That's he's such a wonderful addition and just really warms my heart. When we saved some kids from the hags, we took them to Blinksy's and they got little doll replicas of their parents and then used a little toy guillotine to behead them. That was amazing.
This is great. It's so good.
Yeah.
They have started to scatter. I've noticed through recent adventures, you will, as a sort of Easter egg, sometimes find a toy that will have the "is no fun, is no Blinsky" tag on it, which is awesome. I think is
it Blinsky or Blinksy? Did I make it cuter than it was?
Blinsky.
It probably is Blinsky.
Blinsky.
I think in my brain, I just made it Blinksy. But the real what the fuck moment that I wanted to talk about that was like just a sort of a crazy one for me and my players the first time that I played was when we're exploring Strahd's castle and we come to that portal, and it's got that kind of that riddle to it that's like one is for this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Pebble portal.
We picked one at random. It took us to the Amber Library out in the mountains in the middle of nowhere.
We
were not prepared for the cold weather. That was a long, cold night, and we had oh my god, it was terrifying. We were just so taken aback and lost and confused. We'd never been anywhere near that area. Countryside at that point in time.
We gotta save some time to talk about the Amber Temple. I know we have a lot of things that we would love to talk about, but
I'm not sure we're covering Amber Temple tonight.
Yeah, but I
maybe
mean,
we can do a Curse of Strahd reprise.
Curse of Strahd series.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that for my players, I think both times I ran it, I think first of all, players respond really well to adventures that are fundamentally about them. You should look for ways to personalize if you can, and
absolutely
find ways that their characters have a connection to Barovia or to some of the other characters. So there's of course Izek Strasny and his dolls, which are supposed to be dolls of Irina, which I couldn't resist changing to dolls of one of my players. Both times, and both times when they have walked into his room and seen hundreds of dolls of themselves on this guy's all over this guy's room. That's been a super effective moment.
I bet.
Yeah. And the other thing is, particularly this was really delicious, and this wasn't really anything that I changed. In my most recent playthrough, the characters were told, I think by Father Donovich in Barovia Village, that they should take Irina to Kresh because there's an angel. Like an angel lives in Kresh. They completely took that at face value. And so much of the first third of the campaign was like, this angel is going to fix everything.
Oh,
we just got to all we got to do is get to Kresh. It's going to fix. One of them got bitten by a vampire, and they're telling each other don't worry. I mean, bitten by a werewolf, and they're telling each other don't worry. The abbot of Kresh is going to sort everything out.
Oh my god!
They really thought that this was going to be the figure that was the sort of opposite number to Strahd. That there was this. It was an angel. It didn't occur to them that it would be anything but fucking angel from the Bible.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so
and
funny.
The conversation they had with him where and I made him only incrementally obvious that he was batshit. So initially very gracious, welcoming conversation. And over the course of about 20 minutes, as he started, talking, he's the answer is love. And sort of, and then it gradually building to him selling this corpse that he'd built, and him saying now, I just need you to get me the right wedding dress.
Oh man!
And then being oh my god, no one is coming to save us. There's no figure in this campaign that's going to bail us out. We're gonna have to do it ourselves because this is just another lunatic.
I could just see all the blood draining from their faces.
Oh my god!
All 7 of them were this is absolutely Act 2 of this campaign is going to be when we hook up with the Abbot of Kresh.
God damn!
And he, tells them you're going to get a heart and you're going to get a brain, and it was nothing. He had nothing for them except can you please get me a wedding dress?
Yep.
Man.
That's an interesting device, though, to get Arena there, because otherwise, I mean, again, after I completed the campaign and, you know, we kind of talked through with our dungeon master, oh, here's some other potential stuff that could have happened or that did happen that you weren't aware of in the campaign. And yeah, there's a pretty special thing that can happen if you bring Arena to Kresh. But we were like, why would we ever do that?
Father Donovich is supposed to suggest taking her there. That does tend to get lost in the shuffle of like, is she supposed to be at the Church of St. Andrew? Are we supposed to like work? And I've never, both times I've run through, Arena has been, I think the first group decided to leave her in Valakai at the church because that was, they get the bones back and they're like, this is holy ground, you got to stay here. She was not happy. And the second time Strahd had got her already before they got to Kresh. Took her.
Okay.
So I've never gotten that moment that you're talking about to actually, it's never happened in a game that I've run.
I think we had
have your players ever done that, Matt? Have they ever gotten her to that? I think it's the
yes,
it's kind of pool. Yeah.
So here's what happened. Yeah, it's the pool in Kresh where it's a holy pool where the spirit of Sergei von Zarevich is supposed to sort of reunite with her. And here's what happened in my first run through, which I thought was amazing. They were all keyed into Arena and they were protecting her, and everybody did a very good job of making sure that she wasn't going to fall prey to any forces of evil. They get to Kresh, they relax, they go through the whole deal with the abbot. Obviously, they have the same kind of idea of, oh God, this guy's insane. We can't deal with him. Freed the mongrel folk from him, and that caused a little bit of a tension in the town when they realized all the mongrel folk were no longer in the abbey. But they came back down to Kresh with Irina and went to the pool, which is, I think, in the very back of the town. And it's essentially barren except for that one little pool. And there's this sort of strange feeling that Irina gets, and she's drawn to the pool. And if you don't stop her, then she essentially just sort of walks into the pool as she sees Sergei's ghost. And if you let her sort of commune with Sergei, then he essentially sort of takes her into the afterlife, a positive thing, and you're sort of given a boon. Well, one of my players was so keyed into protecting Irina that she clearly saw this spiritual figure as another trick, right? I had done such a number of the party of convincing them that there is no hope in this place, that something is going to happen to Irina. So she runs into the pool and tackles Irina. And if you do that, the dark powers essentially see the hope of this woman being pulled away, and like a lightning bolt, I think, like strikes down into the pool and either toasts the character and or Irina. And from what I remember, I think the lightning bolt actually did an enormous amount of damage to the person who tackled Irina, but absolutely fried her. Irina. Completely destroyed. And she was in tears, like the player herself. She's like, no, this is not what I meant to do. I didn't, no. And then she got a real hard on for Strahd because she thought that Strahd had done this. And when we finally got to the end, she was the one who put the literal nail in the coffin on him. And there's sort of a little epilogue where you see the spirit of Irina and Sergei sort of meeting over the cliff that sort of Irina walks out into the space on the precipice where years before Tatiana jumped off of the castle grounds and into the fog where never was seen again. And instead, Irina is sort of, reaches out to Sergei and they walk into the sun, which is never seen the sun in Barovia before. But because this character's efforts stopped that from happening, I just had Sergei's ghost, which was actually real, appear before her, and she was so repentant that she reached out for Sergei, and Sergei took her hand instead. Wow. And it was amazing. It was so like gut-wrenching for everybody.
That's really beautiful.
It also goes to show one of the interesting elements of the story of Curse of Strahd is there is very little plot armor, even when you, as a player, like you're given this ally by the Taroka deck. That character is not invulnerable.
Oh, yes.
Right? Like it's not like your destiny that this character is going to survive until you get them to Strahd. They can die. Irina can die. Like the adventure it's very well done in that way, in that fundamentally, it's about the players versus Strahd. There's all of these other really interesting plot elements, but none of them are essential. You know, the players can, it's all up for grabs. Well, that final confrontation is going to happen, but everything else is up for grabs.
Yeah. Which actually, that's another thing that I think really helps to create this atmosphere and this sort of this atmosphere of fear and paranoia, even among seasoned players, is you have to be so careful with the items that you've acquired. Because like you pull the sun sword out at the wrong time and somebody sees it, you know, not even somebody, it could be like a wolf sees it. And if you don't kill that wolf, word could get back to Strahd and it could be stolen from you. You know, you might have to even go back to Madame Eva and get another tarot reading because, you know, the circumstances have changed so much. And that's something I think this sort of, there's always eyes watching. Sorry, and I will go back to the thing going to say, but I did want to say that too, that I think that that atmosphere of you're never really safe and you're always being watched and there's spies everywhere, that helped me feel scared even as a seasoned player. But well, yeah, the thing I was going to say is that it could be, you know, it could be stolen from you. Your story could change. Even you pull that sun sword out too soon and Strahd sees it, you could start the battle then and there that kills you. You know, you really have to be so careful about how you do everything.
All right, guys. Well, I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours, but
oh my gosh.
It is
but we shouldn't.
Awesome conversation. We will. I'd like to do something like this monthly. You know, I don't think every month will be Christmas Strahd. But we could talk about different adventures or other different materials. Maybe we can talk a little bit about different character classes at some point.
Sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And stuff like that. So if you're but thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Rachel and Matt, for joining me. This is Tal from Cast Party, and thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.